You got battery.
You got airplanes?
You got airplane.
Ready? I'm honored to have been included in this event and applaud what our spring break and DC Students for a Democratic Society are doing here in Washington, D.C. for spring break, where it tends to be cold and wet and miserable. We are now at 6 years of bloody and horrific occupation of Iraq and 7.5 in Afghanistan. That means that most college students in the United States were not college students when this began. Opposing something that you grow up with takes more wisdom and more nerve, and yet we see young people in this town and in this country opposing the way old people have always destroyed our environment, the way old people have always borrowed and misspent money, the way old people in our nation have always treated other people around the world exactly as we teach young children never to treat each other. And little children in Iraq and Afghanistan have grown up with these wars and been scarred by them in ways that it is difficult to think about for very long. An Iraqi journalist who threw his shoes at George W. Bush and who could, if he chooses, be elected president of Iraq in 3 years when he is released at the age of 33, was only 24 when this began. And for a decade prior, lived in a nation that knew our nation through sanctions and bombings. We've now built permanent U.S. military bases all over his country, which most people there, including our own generals, think we will never abandon. Meanwhile, we do not provide housing to our own people, to the people of this city and this country, much less Iraq, where 5 million have been displaced from their homes, over 1 million killed, many millions injured, virtually everyone's family impacted in a way that's not familiar to most American places outside New Orleans. And what have we learned in 6 years? Many Americans have learned that the war on Iraq was based on lies and have learned to be suspicious of similar lies about Iran, but some have not yet learned to oppose war as an instrument of policy because the occupation of Afghanistan is still not as unpopular as that in Iraq. And I doubt most Americans know that we pay to maintain 1,000 bases in nations around the world and the harm that they do. What has been learned has been in large part taught by the peace movement. We knew 6 years ago and a year before that this war would be fraudulent, illegal, and disastrous. Many of you knew it and could have served better in Congress than the actual members of Congress had you not been busy attending high school. Today, there are hearings in Congress on suicides in the U.S. military. The people we recruit to commit our crimes now end up killing themselves at an alarming rate. If that finally wakes up a few of the zombies roaming Capitol Hill, it won't be a minute too soon. But it has to be asked, where are the hearings on Iraqis, Afghanis, Pakistanis, and Palestinians? A victim of U.S. torture testified last year by satellite to an almost empty congressional committee room, after which Congressman Rohrabacher informed him that in a war, mistakes have to be tolerated. And our senators now talk about truth and reconciliation, oblivious to the fact that including the people with whom we have to become reconciled is literally unthinkable to Congress members. The idea is for us to get reconciled with ourselves. But we must never, ever become reconciled with a nation that commits war crimes. I'm glad that students want a democratic society. If we had direct democracy or even reasonable representation, every soldier, mercenary, and contractor would have come back from Iraq years ago. A solid majority of Americans has opposed this war for years, and about half, and steadily rising, oppose the occupation of Afghanistan. A democratic society cannot coexist with the presidential powers that were seized by Bush and that are now being maintained and expanded by Obama. A democratic society does not have secret government agencies, secret laws, laws rewritten by the executive, one man with the power of war, one man with the power of the purse, one man with the power of treaties. Yet President Obama who to his credit has said he will end torture and close one of the many places where we detain people outside the law, last week wrote a signing statement telling Congress not to interfere in his constitutional power to make treaties, despite the fact that the Constitution says that 2/3 of the Senate must approve any treaty. We are being sold changiness when we asked for transformational change. We're done with extraordinary rendition because rendition will now be ordinary. We have no more enemy combatants, yet we are detaining hundreds of combative nemesis. Yesterday I got an email from Amnesty International asking me to object to Obama reviving Bush policies. Well, they never died, and they are not policies. They are what we used to call crimes. Also yesterday, the ACLU finally came to its senses and asked the Attorney General to appoint a special prosecutor and enforce the law. And yet too many in the peace movement don't want to talk about the law, even the law against aggressive war, and too many do not even want to talk about war, preferring to talk about military spending. And we must talk about military spending, but doing that alone will not end wars. And the wars are just as bloody, no matter who sleeps in the White House. It's easier to talk about money, now that everything that needs it lacks it. But it's also harder because we now have toy money, borrowed from China and invented by the Fed at the drop of a hat in military quantities. We may even end up halting some weapons programs, especially those that don't work or are designed to fight the Soviet Union or the Japanese fleet, but this Congress and President want to increase the overall budget for killing. This will be a victory against corruption on behalf of the greatest moral corruption known to our species. For what we are giving to bankers, we could give tens of thousands of dollars to every person in this country, but for what we are spending, including indirect economic costs on the occupation of Iraq, we could give $100,000 to every person in Iraq. Let's get our priorities straight, including ending wars, not just because they're badly fought or corruptly managed, but because they kill human beings. Let's end the occupations. Let's end the missile strikes. Let's close the bases. Let's bring our brothers and our sisters home. Let's prosecute the war criminals. And yes, let's have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to reconcile this country with the other 95% of humanity. Thank you.